April 5th, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt ordered the greatest theft in American history and made it completely legal. In one executive order, he stole $2.8 billion worth of gold from American citizens. What happened next shocked the world and set the stage for a geopolitical monetary crisis. This is the story of how a president broke the Constitution, violated property rights, and changed money forever. To understand this audacious theft, you need to first see how utterly desperate America had become. By 1933, the Great Depression was not just an economic downturn, it was an existential crisis that had crushed the nation's spirit. The sheer scale of the collapse is often sanitized by history books, but the reality on the ground was a terrifying cycle of deflation, destitution, and despair. Between 1929 and 1933, over 9,000 banks had failed. This wasn't a slow erosion of wealth. It was a violent, sudden evaporation of family savings, leaving millions penniless overnight. When a bank failed, people didn't just lose access to their money. They lost their money entirely, as Federal Deposit Insurance, the FDIC, had yet to be established. The failure was compounded by the structure of the fractional reserve banking system. When a rumor spread that a bank was unsound, customers were rushed to withdraw their deposits, a phenomenon known as a bank run. Since banks held only a small fraction of deposits in reserve, they quickly ran out of cash. In a time of profound uncertainty, citizens wanted to exchange their vulnerable paper dollars for something unassailable, something tangible. Gold. This scramble for gold created a deadly drain on the nation's monetary base, further constricting credit and accelerating the economic collapse. Money was not circulating, it was being hoarded. The unemployment rate had spiked to a staggering 25%, meaning 1 in 4 workers was without a job. Factories sat idle, farms were foreclosed upon, and families were literally starving in cities and Dust Bowl-ravaged farmlands. The American dream had become the American nightmare. This collapse was exacerbated by a vicious deflationary spiral. As demand evaporated, prices for goods and services fell relentlessly. While lower prices might sound good, in this environment, they were disastrous. Businesses couldn't make a profit, so they cut wages and fired workers. People who had borrowed money found that their debt, say a $10,000 mortgage, was now harder to pay off because the value of the dollars they earned had increased while their nominal income had decreased. This deflationary pressure made holding gold a rational economic choice for the average American, as a gold coin retained its purchasing power while a paper dollar was a potential casualty of bank failure. Roosevelt's decision to seize gold was made even more shocking by the nature of his 1932 presidential campaign. He had successfully run on a platform that, paradoxically, spoke of protecting individual liberty and limiting government power. Yet, once in office, facing the immense pressure of the Depression, FDR would abandon this classical liberal philosophy. The need for radical and immediate action superseded constitutional fidelity in the minds of his advisors. The banking system was literally on life support, having been completely shut down for a week during the bank holiday of March 1933. If people continued to hoard gold instead of spending paper money, the economy couldn't recover, and the government's immense New Deal recovery plans, which required massive spending, would be starved of the necessary monetary maneuverability. Roosevelt concluded that to save the system, he had to violate the most basic principle of a free market, the right to private property. He needed to break the public's faith in gold and force their faith back into fiat currency controlled by the government. The solution was shocking. He would steal America's gold, but he would do it legally, under the cloak of a national emergency. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wasn't just any president. He was a revolutionary. He was a man who believed government not only could solve every problem, but must solve every problem, even if it meant trampling individual rights and historical precedents. Born into immense wealth and privilege, FDR's early life lacked the financial hardship that might have made him more sympathetic to the gold hoarders, many of whom were simply protecting their meager savings. However, his personal battle with polio gave him a unique perspective on crisis and the absolute necessity of forceful and coordinated action. He understood power, and once in the Oval Office, he surrounded himself with a group of academic advisors known as the Brain Trust, including figures like Raymond Moley and Rexford Tugwell. The Brain Trust, particularly agricultural economist George F. Warren of Cornell, convinced FDR that the key to ending the deflationary spiral was to devalue the dollar relative to gold. Warren argued that commodity prices were fundamentally linked to the gold price, and that by raising the gold price, they could deliberately trigger inflation, thereby easing the debt burden on farmers and jump-starting investment. This theory, known as the commodity theory of money, provided the intellectual justification for a breathtaking act of manipulation of money. Roosevelt's plan was brilliant and multifaceted in its simplicity. First, declare a national emergency. Second, seize the gold. Third, devalue the dollar, realizing a massive, instant profit for the government. Roosevelt needed a loyal and capable administrator to execute the scheme. That someone was Henry Morgenthau Jr., his close friend and eventual Treasury Secretary. Morgenthau came from a family of influential bankers and understood the inner workings of the financial system intimately. He would become the unapologetic executioner of the policy. The legal framework was a masterstroke of political expediency, the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. This law was passed during World War I to prevent Americans from providing financial aid or engaging in trade with Germany or its allies. By classifying the Depression as a national emergency, an internal war against economic collapse, Roosevelt argued that he could invoke this wartime power to steal from his own citizens during peacetime. This cynical reinterpretation was the legal veil drawn over what was at its heart a confiscatory act. The date was April 5, 1933. The document, Executive Order 6102, stands as the official record of the greatest monetary transformation in American history. It was the decree that legalized the theft of private wealth. The order was simple, brutal, and comprehensive. All persons are hereby required to deliver on or before May 1, 1933, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them to the Federal Reserve Bank in their district or to any member bank of the Federal Reserve System. The price offered to the citizens was $20.67 per troy ounce. This price wasn't a fair market assessment. It was the statutory price that had been fixed in 1879. The citizens were being paid with paper dollars which, due to the impending devaluation, Roosevelt knew were worth significantly less than their gold. This wasn't merely an exchange. It was a mandatory sale at an artificially suppressed government-fixed price. The order applied to virtually every individual and private entity, but included key exceptions: monetary gold held by the Federal Reserve and commercial banks, industrial gold needed for legitimate trades, dentistry, jewelry, etc., and rare coin collections exempted for numismatic value. In effect, the government and large industrial users, the entity that the administration relied upon for economic recovery, could keep their gold. But the ordinary American, the small business owner, the person who distrusted paper money and kept a few gold certificates in a safe deposit box, they had to surrender theirs. This created a two-tiered system that protected the powerful while expropriating the wealth of the common citizen. The deadline was merciless. Citizens had less than a month to comply. Failure to comply was a federal crime, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, a sum equivalent to roughly $230,000 today. The penalty was explicitly designed to compel immediate and total compliance, making the threat of resistance too costly for almost anyone to contemplate. Roosevelt then tightened the financial noose.
He quickly followed up with Executive Order 6111, which made it illegal to export gold from the United States without a Treasury license. Americans couldn't even flee the country with their physical wealth. They were effectively trapped within the U.S. monetary system. The government had successfully monopolized gold ownership. The stage was set for the spectacular profit. The public compliance was, by historical accounts, surprisingly high, driven by a mixture of patriotism, fear of severe penalties, and a deep-seated desire for the Depression to finally end. The Federal Reserve and its member banks became the collection points, tasked with gathering the wealth of the nation under duress.
Frederick Barber Campbell became the most famous early victim of Roosevelt's gold seizure. A successful New York businessman and investor, Campbell had accumulated a substantial holding of 5,000 troy ounces of gold, worth about $100,000 at the time, equivalent to over $2 million today. When Campbell, a staunch constitutionalist, refused to surrender his gold, the government struck back with the full, merciless force of federal power. They prosecuted him in federal court, charging him with hoarding gold in violation of Executive Order 6102. The case, United States versus Campbell, was more than a trial. It was a political demonstration designed to send a chilling message to the entire nation. Campbell's lawyers argued that the order violated the Fifth Amendment's protection against taking private property without just compensation, and the 10th Amendment's reservation of powers to the states or the people. They pointed out that the Constitution explicitly stated that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. The defense maintained that the national emergency was a mere pretext to justify an unconstitutional seizure. However, the trial was a sham in terms of judicial impartiality. The judge was a Roosevelt appointee, handpicked to ensure the government's victory. The trial lasted just 3 days. Campbell was found guilty, his gold was confiscated, and he was sentenced to a federal prison term. While his case would eventually reach the Supreme Court, the immediate damage was done. Roosevelt had proven that even the most sacred constitutional protections could be suspended when the government claimed an economic emergency, effectively establishing the precedent that the power of the state outweighed the rights of the individual in times of crisis. The message was clear: dissent would be punished, and compliance was mandatory. What happened next shocked the world and set the stage for a geopolitical monetary crisis. As news of Roosevelt's gold seizure spread, foreign governments and central banks panicked. If America, the supposed bastion of property rights, could seize gold from its own citizens, what would stop other countries from doing the same? This was not merely a domestic issue. It was a declaration that the dollar's promise to pay gold was no longer reliable, rattling the foundations of the global gold exchange standard. Foreign governments began to move their assets. France, under President François Mitterrand, began transferring its gold reserves from New York to Paris. The Netherlands moved its gold from London to New York, then quickly back to Amsterdam, a reflection of the deep uncertainty. Belgium secretly shipped its gold to London for safekeeping. International confidence in the dollar and, indeed, in the integrity of all sovereign currencies collapsed. But the real shock came when Roosevelt announced the second critical part of his plan, the devaluation of the dollar. Through the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, the official price of gold was raised from $20.67 to $35 per ounce. This wasn't just theft, it was legal robbery with a staggering profit margin, known as seigniorage. The government's gold holdings, which had been compulsorily acquired from citizens and held by the Federal Reserve, were officially valued at $2.8 billion at the old price. At the new $35 price, that same physical gold was suddenly worth $4.6 billion.
Roosevelt had made a direct, instantaneous profit of $1.8 billion, a massive 64% profit on the expropriated wealth. This $1.8 billion was deposited into a special account called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, ESF, which the Treasury could use to manipulate the foreign exchange markets, granting the executive branch immense, unchecked power over the value of the dollar on the global stage. Every ounce of gold the government had stolen from Americans was now worth almost twice as much on the Treasury's books. The U.S. had effectively defaulted on its gold obligations to its own people, a betrayal that deeply damaged its credibility. In 1935, the Supreme Court finally ruled on the legality of Roosevelt's gold seizure and the nullification of private contracts requiring payment in gold. This was the famous set of cases known as the Gold Clause cases. The lead case was Perry versus United States, named after a Louisiana businessman who had bought government bonds with gold clauses that explicitly guaranteed payment in gold dollars, the 1935 equivalent of gold itself. The other key cases, Nortz versus United States and Norman versus Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, dealt with private contracts and corporate bonds. Initially, the Supreme Court, which was dominated by conservative justices known as the Four Horsemen, shocked everyone by ruling 5-4 that Roosevelt's nullification of the gold clauses was unconstitutional as applied to government bonds. Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes wrote a stinging opinion, stating that the government had violated its sovereign promise by taking property without just compensation. The ruling was a massive legal victory for the sanctity of contracts. However, Roosevelt wasn't about to let the Supreme Court stop his New Deal. He reacted with political fury, threatening to implement his infamous court-packing plan, which would allow him to add more justices to the court, up to 15 total, effectively guaranteeing a majority that would uphold his legislation. He publicly called the dissenting justice horse and buggy lawyers who didn't understand modern economics. The justice, fearing a complete destruction of the court's independence, got the message. In a subsequent review of the rulings, the court reversed course. While maintaining the unconstitutionality of the government's repudiation of its own gold clause bonds, the court ruled that the bondholders had suffered no actual, measurable loss because paper dollars were still required to be spent at the legal tender rate. This became known as the switch in time that saved 9. Justice Owen Roberts changed his vote to uphold New Deal legislation, preventing Roosevelt from packing the court and effectively upholding the gold seizure. The Constitution, it seemed, was flexible when the president needed it to be, establishing the principle that in the event of a conflict, the government's control over the currency would supersede private contracts and even constitutional property rights. Roosevelt's gold seizure changed America forever, establishing a profound and dangerous precedent. It proved that constitutional protections were, in practice, meaningless when the government successfully claimed a state of economic emergency. It codified the principle that private property could be seized for the greater good, paving the way for the massive expansion of federal regulatory and executive power. The gold seizure also marked the effective end of the classical gold standard in America. From 1934 onward, the dollar was no longer convertible into gold for American citizens. The dollar became an IOU from the government, backed not by tangible gold, but by faith in the government's political promises and its power of taxation. This move formally transformed the U.S. into a fiat currency system domestically, albeit one that retained an international gold component. The $35 per ounce price became the new anchor, and this price was the foundation upon which the Bretton Woods system was built after World War II, establishing the U.S. dollar as the primary reserve currency, but the foundation was built on stolen gold. This precedent created a dangerous shift in the power dynamic between the citizen and the state. If the government could seize gold during an economic emergency, what couldn't it seize during other emergencies? Could it seize stocks, bonds, real estate? The very mechanism, the declaration of emergency under the Trading with the Enemy Act, was an open invitation for future presidential overreach. Roosevelt's successors would indeed use similar emergency powers to implement wage and price controls, as Nixon did in 1971, ration food and fuel, and restrict civil liberties. The gold seizure was just the beginning of a massive expansion of the administrative state. The final and complete severing of the dollar from gold came in 1971 with the Nixon shock, when President Nixon unilaterally ended the international convertibility of the dollar to gold, the gold window, formally dismantling Bretton Woods. This move, 38 years after FDR's seizure, was the ultimate logical conclusion of Executive Order 6102. Today, Americans can legally own gold again, but the constitutional and economic reality remains. Our money is backed only by government decree, a structure made possible by the legal theft orchestrated by Franklin D. Roosevelt. The ultimate legacy is the enduring question: if the right to private property can be erased by an executive order, what protections do citizens truly have?